Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth and final, for now, Platform YA Book Club live stream. Today we are joined by author Kat Ellis, who wrote this week's book club book, Harrow Lake. So for those of you who are watching this, if that is the case by now, then what have you been missing? 3 weeks of amazing author interviews. The book club is an event that we were running all throughout August. We were all reading one book per week. And then at the end of the week, talking to the author themselves and asking them any questions that we wanted to about the book that we had just read together. So as I maybe hinted just a second ago, we are hoping to continue this book club on a monthly basis going forward rather than every single week. I think that we would all just pass out from exhaustion if that was the case. So we are going to be going back into the Penguin offices, having a little plan in the next couple of weeks, but hopefully next month we are going to be starting it on a monthly basis. How you get involved will be the same. So what we have been doing is these author live streams after we've read the books. We've been using the hashtag Platform YA Book Club in order to discuss the book with each other on social, post images of the books to Instagram, all that good stuff. We also have a Discord, so we have linked that below. If you're interested in joining the Discord, we're going to be continuing that indefinitely now, which is really, really exciting. We have loads of book memes over there, people giving reading recommendations, all that kind of stuff. It's been really fantastic. And also, if you run a book Instagram, YouTube channel, Twitter, TikTok yourself, and you want us to have a look at your stuff, if you're doing something to do with the books in the book club, then please send us a DM, show us your stuff. We would love to take a look. So as I said, we are going to be talking to Kat today. I'm going to be asking her some of my questions, and then I am also going to be asking her some questions you have already submitted. And if you're watching live, you can type your questions into the chat, and my lovely colleague Simon is accumulating them all in a document for me to read. So we are going to ask her all of your questions. We are going to get through them all. We're going to make it happen. The last thing to mention is, obviously, I know that some of you may not have finished the book yet. If that is the case, don't worry, because we are going to do the first part of this stream as spoiler free, and then we are going to transition into a spoiler section, and I will make it very obvious when that's going to happen, so you can pause the video, finish the book, and then come back. So without further ado, we are going to get to the questions. Hello, Kat, how's it going?
Hi, Rowan. Great, thank you very much.
So we are going to start this live stream off with a question that has been submitted to us, actually. We had two people who wanted to know kind of similar questions, so I'll read both of them and we can kind of talk through it. So we have Miss Tanel wanted to know, was Harrow Lake inspired by any particular horror movies? And 20-something asks, you focus a lot on horror movies and Harrow Lake. Do you like horror movies yourself? And what's your favourite horror movie? So what's your favourite horror movie, and have any of your favourites inspired Harrow Lake?
God, well, I really, really love horror movies, and grew up watching them from far too early an age, to be honest. So the 80s and 90s slasher movies, big franchises, Halloween, Friday the 13th, all of those big ones. But I also really love, the modern, more thinky ones like Babadook. That's been a recent favourite. Get Out and Us, and also love big monster horrors, like the sci-fi horrors like Pitch Black and Alien and stuff like that. So quite a wide spectrum of films that I love and that have somewhat influenced my ideas when I was writing Harrow Lake. I think Babadook, which I mentioned just then, it was definitely an influence on it, around the monster in the book, Mr. Jitters. But also, urban legends like Slender Man, things like that have played a big part in it.
I can definitely see that, I think, within the book itself. So I kind of wanted to take you back to not necessarily Harrow Lake in particular, but just when you started writing, was it something that you always did as a kid? You were always scribbling? You've got tons of books that you've written already, kind of from when you were a teenager, or is it something that you've kind of come into more recently?
Well, writing stories was always something that I enjoyed, and as a kid, at that sort of kid level, I was always quite good at it, I think. So I was quite confident in myself as a child that I could write stories, but I was also really aimless, so it never ever occurred to me that I might be able to write as a job, become an author. Never occurred to me even when I was in uni, because I studied English for creative writing when I was in uni. And that was just because I enjoyed it, not even a thought to what sort of job I would do afterwards. And then I kind of drifted into it when I was around 25. I thought, oh, I've been reading a lot of YA books recently. I really like them, so let's have a go. So that was really how I came to it, not through any sort of careful planning or cleverness. It was just an accident, really.
So with Harrow Lake, how long did that process take? Like when you started to get inspired by it, was that something that you were thinking about for quite a long time and ruminating on, or was it kind of like a lightning strikes moment, got to get all the ideas down over in a super short amount of time?
Yeah, well, this was, I'd written a few before Harrow Lake, so, you think the more you write, the better you become at it, so it should take a shorter amount of time, but I'm finding the opposite. The more books that I write, it seems to take longer with each one, because I think I'm seeing more of the mistakes I'm making as I go through the writing process. Harrow Lake, I think all in all, like going back and forth between it and other projects, it took me about 3 years to write this one.
Wow.
It looked very different, the first draft. There's the movie that's mentioned in the book called Nightjar. The plot of the original draft was very much like the movie of Nightjar, which is now just like a few little lines that are mentioned in Harrow Lake. So I know that backstory really well, but wasn't really that useful.
I was going to ask about that, because I think that it feels quite fleshed out, all of these, as I was reading especially the talking about Nolan's films. I kind of felt like I was almost like, oh, these could be books in and of themselves. Part of me was like, no, don't write it in here. You can write that as a book later. Like, this is a whole idea. Like, feel really, really fleshed out, because some of them you kind of just talk about the premise, the initial premise, but quite a few of them you go into the idea of like what the actual plot is and what the outcome is for it, especially Nightjar. Were you ever tempted to like keep some of them back to like, oh, actually that's pretty good, maybe I'll write something about that later? Or was it like, no, I want to put kind of fleshed out stories to kind of keep the world of Nolan's kind of auteurship alive within the book?
Well, to be honest, it was a bit of both. Some of the little like story nuggets that are in it, some have made it through to the final edition, but some have been taken out. But they're quite often bits and pieces that I've cannibalized from other stories that have just, ended up in a drawer. So I might take something out of that, maybe a chapter that was quite useful, that, would make a nice little sort of story that Lola might refer to or have made up. Other times it literally just sort of seemed to be inspired by the characters, the kind of stories that I thought Nolan would be interested in. So I sort of try and think what would he want to make as a film, and just kind of take bits and pieces out of the ether, I suppose.
I want to ask about like horror as a genre, because I think there's a lot of kind of tropes and archetypes and things that are involved within horror. How far were you aware of those and wanting to either like lean into them or change them or subvert them in some way? Was that a big part of the process, or were you kind of writing and then realized like, oh, I've kind of picked up these little elements from this genre kind of without necessarily going into looking at which ones you wanted to include consciously?
Well, having a main character who's grown up around, the world of horror, it made it really interesting, actually, because she was very much aware of, different tropes and, things going on around her. So she had that kind of slightly meta way of looking at what was happening to her, even as she's sort of living through a horror story. She'd be, there's one scene where she's in Lorelei's bedroom and she hears something underneath the bed. And she says to herself, this is the point, in any horror movie where the main character should run but doesn't. And so she runs because she knows better. So I got to, play with some of the tropes that way, and bringing in a monster who, represents quite a lot of different things and connects very much with Lola's own family history. I think that was an interesting way to play on the monster trope. But yeah, I mean, a lot of that came in with kind of the layered way that I write stories. When I'm first drafting, I don't tend to be thinking too much about genre and things like that. I write the story as it needs to be told, and it's usually quite rubbishy, the first draft. So I just go over it and over it, layer the details over the top of it, and it sort of all comes together in the end.
Are you a big planner then? Do you kind of have like a, you know, the story arc, the like 3-act structure or whatever kind of structure you use down first, kind of draft 0 and then build from it? Or do you kind of, the first draft you start writing and then see where it takes you and come back to it afterwards?
I do. I always have an outline in mind with some, you know, key milestones that the story has to sort of wend its way around before it reaches the conclusion. I'll usually have a really good idea of where the story's going to end. And then I'll write an outline and, you know, scene summaries and things like that. And then when I'm writing it, completely dismiss them. So the story ends up nothing like I planned, but it usually ends up in the same spot, but just gets there very differently as, you know, character traits emerge and things like that. And I get other ideas as I'm writing it that might take it off in a different direction. So I basically just, I'm quite happy to throw away my own ideas if something better occurs to me.
That's fair enough. I want to talk a little bit kind of like digging into the book slightly, just looking at the choice to write in present tense was really interesting to me because I think it's quite unusual style to choose. I think a lot of the time we kind of assume that past tense is where it's going to go, but I think it really, there was this immediacy to it that made total sense to me, that it was going to be something that was told from a first person point of view, kind of like present tense, very much like this is happening right now. It felt very filmic in a lot of ways, kind of cinematic in terms of I could imagine what was happening on screen, almost like a film, as well as like the great thing about novels being obviously being able to see people's internal world. Was that a conscious choice from the very start to do, or was it just you started writing and found yourself within that kind of immediacy as you were going?
Well, it seemed to work quite well for Lola's sort of setting things out the way she would be thinking and feeling in the moment. And it was quite important, I think, to capture that as it was happening. And, you know, from a very sort of nitpicky kind of a technical standpoint, if you're writing first person in the past tense, then you generally know that the main character is okay at the end to be telling that story in past tense. And I didn't want that to be sort of signed and sealed without giving any spoilers whatsoever. I wanted it to be very much focused on what's happening to Lola in the present, and then after the story is concluded, let the reader decide what's happened then.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So a lot of people that kind of watch these streams and that are involved in platform are interested in writing themselves. They're like either aspiring writers or they've done a bit of writing before. So we always like to ask a few questions kind of from that point of view about writing advice and stuff like that. So I wanted to ask, does the place where you sit down to write matter? I guess especially for a book like this that's so atmospheric and so like the setting is such a big part of it. Do you feel like you had to kind of be in that mind frame somehow through music, through like the place you were writing, or could you just like go to a Starbucks and be like, oh, here I go, typing out another chapter of Harrow Lake?
I suppose when I'm actually sitting down and writing it, the most important thing for me is that I've got, a desk and a tidy space around me where I can not be distracted by all the things that I would normally be distracted by. I can't actually listen to music when I'm writing. I do a lot when I'm editing, and I find that helps me get into a certain frame of mind and especially get into the right mood for certain scenes. Listen to some, real loud, hellish music if you're writing a good killing scene. But one thing that I do find helps to inspire me as I'm coming up with story ideas is that I quite often go adventuring around North Wales where I live and looking at, old cemeteries and ruined churches and castles and things like that, and sort of getting into a spooky headspace and just sort of letting the ideas simmer away as I'm walking.
Amazing. We have a question from the live stream from Isabel Bradshaw, who has been at some of these live streams before. Hello, Isabel. What did you do for work after uni? Did you do journalism or something like that? Or did you go straight into writing?
I had so little idea of what I actually wanted to do after I graduated. I joined a temping agency. And the first place that they sent me was to work in the local council, doing some admin work. And I ended up staying with my local council for about 10 years in various different jobs. So that was what I did up until the point where I decided to give writing full time ago. And, that took a few years as well to take off.
Amazing. I have a question about pacing, because I think this is maybe kind of an interesting question for someone who's interested in writing. How do you go about pacing a horror book right? You know, bringing in a creeping sense of dread rather than just going straight in with the scares to begin with. How did that come to you? Was that quite natural for you? Did it feel like you were kind of comfortable with that within the genre, like with stuff you'd read or things that you'd watched? Or were you always kind of like, oh, maybe I need to keep a bit back for later on down in the book?
That all comes about for me when I'm revising a book, when I'm editing it. I think you can gain a certain perspective after you've written a good draft, and maybe that's not your first draft, it's, you know, your second, third, or however many drafts you feel gets you to a good draft. And then if you take a step away from it and come back and read it, you can often see pacing issues, and, you know, where you might have, you know, bits where it's lagging, you can add a bit more tension, whether that's just, you know, building in little creepy atmospheric elements, or whether it's, you know, some enormous scare. I think it depends entirely on, you know, just stepping back and taking a look at it, and I think you can see a lot about the flow of things then.
Because I think that's something that maybe isn't a lot of young people aren't necessarily that aware of, that when you get the book that you read, that's nowhere near the first draft that an author has done, right? You're going to be doing a draft and then revising it and then sending it to people, and then you've got to send it to an agent, and then it will probably get changed once it's with your agent, and then it might get changed once it's with a publisher. So I think it's always quite, if you're feeling daunted by reading Harrow Lake or reading a book that you really loved and thinking, oh God, I could never write something like that. When I try and write something, it doesn't turn out like that. There are so many drafts and changes that you can go through, and edits that happen, and other people who come on and suggest things. So it's not like you just kind of magically birth this whole Harrow Lake all done and dusted the first time you put pen to paper.
I wish it happened that way, but
I've got a question from Always Smiling. Lovely username. What would your best or top piece of advice be for young writers?
I think related to what we were just talking about, getting used to asking people for feedback, and sort of taking a step back from your book and viewing it quite emotionlessly, if you can. You know, when somebody gives you a criticism of your writing, it's quite easy to feel defensive because, you know, you put so much of yourself into it. But it's an important thing to learn to take criticism, and that doesn't always necessarily mean taking on board somebody else's suggestions about what to change in your work, but to be able to sort of think objectively about feedback that you get and to use it to your benefit. I think if you can find people who also write who will give you feedback, and you can give them feedback on their work, that will always help you improve your writing.
A question we kind of touched on earlier, the idea of like the different stories that were in Harrow Lake. We have a question from Levi. What specifically inspired the town tales? Did you think of them yourself? Were they based on like urban legends that you'd heard? Where did that inspiration come from?
Well, thinking about things like the bone tree where people hang their teeth so Mr. Jitters won't come and get them. That
really cool. Love that. That wasn't spooky at all, Kat. Read this book. A lot of the times when I was reading this book was when it was dark outside, it was nighttime, and I was just like, this is cool, this is fine. A bone tree, yeah, nice. Love that.
Yeah, a lot of people have said that they're a bit icked about the teeth, so sorry. But yeah, I mean, things like that just kind of were a natural tangent for me when I was thinking about, you know, the legend of Mr. Jitters himself, and he's, you know, this man who was a 1920s bootlegger who got trapped underground and ended up cannibalizing other people who'd been in a landslide. So that was how he became a monster. So I was trying to think, you know, what other kind of local legends would have sprang from that. So, you know, it being a very weird place, things like the bone tree and, you know, don't walk in the woods when there's a full moon, otherwise, you know, roots will spring from your feet and you'll turn into part of the forest. Stuff like that just kind of naturally seemed to spring from the whole, you know, background of Mr. Jitters, I think.
We've got a very long question from Lily, but it's a great question from Lily Venturous. I understand Harrow Lake is a very original and unique town, but I was wondering whether there was a town or place in particular that you based Harrow Lake off, or where you got your inspiration from the town from. Also, we're interested to know some tips for creating a location or mythical town for horror stories, because you described Harrow Lake in such an amazing way that made it really feel as if you were there. I'd love to know what helped you to do this so effectively.
Well, thank you very much, Lily. Honestly, the setting is usually one of the first things that comes to mind with me when I'm coming up with a story idea. I especially like weird small towns. I can't say that I've ever been to one that was like Harrow Lake, thankfully, because you want to just turn straight around and leave. But yeah, I take bits and pieces, from my local habitat. I went out and found some caves nearby. They're called the Fish Caves in Prestatyn, in case you're interested in looking them up on Google. But they're old mining caves, and I went in and took some pictures, which are on my Instagram. You can see them there. And they inspired the caves where Mr. Jitters is in Harrow Lake. So I take bits and pieces that are going to work for a story and try and build and choose the location itself. I mean, it's set in Indiana, where I've never actually been, so there was a lot of Googling involved there as well. But I just choose somewhere that has the right kind of geology and geography to suit my story in the end. Somewhere that had forest, that had history with mining and things like that. So yeah, it all kind of comes together with lots of research.
We've actually just had a question on the chat that I think links into this from Samantha Clark. As a British writer, what prompted you to set the story in America? Or was it about the US?
Yeah, I mean, I've generally set my stories in America, and I think this is just a personal thing for me. It's part of making it a pure creation that isn't just me kind of like taking too much inspiration from real world settings. I think just making sure that it kind of sits outside of my comfort zone as much as anything else. And it seemed with Harrow Lake, because I did debate over whether to make it a British location or some other part of the world, it did seem like it would work best within an American setting. And then Indiana was just like me zooming in on the map there.
I think it's kind of interesting, this there's like this saying about in America 100 years is a long time, in Europe 100 miles is a long way, where actually if you're going to set kind of like this gothic feeling, like she's in a town but it's very much like you could get lost and you're not going to be able to escape it, like, and especially as a teenager she kind of is relying on other people to drive her places or to do things. And so I think the thing about America is, because it's such a vast country, you can have this very isolated town that feels like you can't escape it, because she could just be wandering around for days and falling into these kind of natural disasters and all this kind of stuff. So I think, yeah, that totally made sense, especially with it being very kind of modern urban legend stuff. It's quite popular in the States, and I think that all made complete sense for it to be an American setting for me. I was really loving the chat. Rebecca Charters had just said, I made sure to read it in the daytime. And Lucy, I read it when there was a storm going on outside. It wasn't creepy at all.
Perfect.
I kind of wanted to ask next about, we kind of talked about the idea of like the nightjar as like its own thing that you'd originally come through as part of the story, and it came through, and then you had all these other legends that you kind of picked away at. Were there any characters that you felt like had their own story within them, or that you could have feasibly written a book about, or that you would have liked to focus on more, that were kind of had to be secondary to Lola's story because of her being the protagonist?
Yeah, I think I definitely could write more about Cora, the young girl that she befriends. Yeah, I think she was my favourite character, to be honest, and I think she could have had lots of stories of her own. I think maybe if I was ever to go back to the world of Harrow Lake and set a story there, I might tell more of Cora's story if I was to do that. Yeah, I try and make sure that all the characters are fleshed out and they are the main characters in their own lives, because that's how we all view ourselves, I think. So it makes sense for them to have detailed backgrounds to them, so it doesn't all just revolve around Lola.
I mean, no spoilers. I will do no spoilers for it, but I feel like that's very much true of this novel, that you really feel like there are these backstories that are just like peeking through, that you know as like a main character, especially in the present tense and like being so immediate, that Lola's like skimming past and like starting to learn about various people. I'm gonna say no more until the spoiler section, just in case I say something that's gonna give something away for someone. I want to know a little bit about inspiration. So do you find that for this book, or for writing in general, you're inspired by particular authors who are the same genre as what you're writing, or the similar age group, like YA authors, or are you pretty broad in terms of your inspiration, and you kind of pick bits and pieces from different writers that really get you excited and inspire you for writing?
I don't tend to take much inspiration from reading other authors. I mean, I read all sorts of different genres within YA and outside of it as well. And, you know, love loads of different horror authors in particular. And Dawn Kurtigic, who's a friend of mine, she's one of my faves. She wrote The Dead House and more recently Teeth in the Mist. And just these really creepy, you know, really pushing the envelope kind of YA horror. But I find if I go into writing a story thinking to myself, I want to write something as good as that or something similar to that, I'll end up trying to mimic rather than, you know, writing something that's my own style and my own story. So I tend more towards getting inspiration from films and from, you know, just reading the history of different places that I go and see. Quite often, you know, you'll read, one of the places that I love getting inspiration from is if you go to a really old cemetery and you can see some quite interesting epitaphs on the gravestones sometimes, and it'll be something very kind of weird, like, you know, "'Twas the seventh burden that did her in," you know, something like that, and you think, what does that mean? You know, you sort of start spinning stories from these little tidbits. And yeah, graphic novels as well, because just that, you know, taking a step away from the medium of the novel and looking at something slightly different, I think that tends to spark ideas for me.
I have a question from Danelle Johns, who asks, I'm curious what your favorite genre is to read or write, and if there's a genre that you'd be willing to write that's outside of your comfort zone that you'd like to try out.
That's a good question. I do read all kinds of different genres. I think people are quite often surprised, you know, if they've read Harrow Lake and hear me say that, you know, I love reading rom-coms and, you know, things like that. Yeah, love a good thriller, murder mysteries, things like that. I do like graphic novels, which I've only really gotten into in the last couple of years. So I've been reading quite a lot of those lately. Yeah, what would I write that would be outside of my comfort zone? To write a romance would be out of my comfort zone, I think. I don't think I'm likely to do it, to be honest. I'm not sure I'd be any good at it. I would love to one day write a horror comedy. I think that's, you know, its own little subgenre that is just really, really cool when you get it right. I mean, films like Beetlejuice and Gina D'Amico's books as well. She writes some really interesting horror comedies. Like there's one called Wax, which is like this town where, you know, people are starting to be replaced by wax figures. Yeah, really cool. I think I would probably go horror comedy if I was going to sort of veer a little bit off course.
Amazing. I want to ask a last question about the sort of, I guess, writing process for anyone who might be kind of interested in that. What would you say has been kind of your biggest struggle as a writer? And do you feel like it's something that you've kind of overcome now that you're on the other side of it, or are you still trying to work your way through it, whatever it is?
My biggest struggle, I'll mention two things that I struggle with in particular. One is questioning myself too much when I'm writing. I wish I was somebody who could sit down, just blast out a draft without going back and editing myself. That's, you know, a piece of advice that you quite often see people saying is just don't edit as you're writing. And I find it impossible not to go back and edit things as I'm writing, because I have such a terrible memory that I know if I've spotted a mistake and I don't fix it immediately, then I'll forget about it and it'll just be there, you know, make its way into the published book, and I'll hate myself. So there's that. That is one thing that I do that I wish I didn't. And the other thing that I have had to overcome, I think a lot of people probably do this, I hope I'm not the only one, I don't think I am, is just faffing too much on social media. I do it way too much. I should just learn to, disconnect from social media, not be instantly replying to everybody, but I can't. I just always have my phone next to me, and it does eat into my time a bit.
We've had another question from the stream, this time from Isabel again. Did you ever relate to any of the characters in the book?
Well, they're quite horrible people generally, so I don't relate too much to them. But there are some similarities, I think. I mean, I've said that Cora's my favourite character, and maybe that is because I do think a little bit like her. I get caught up in stories and will be a little bit macabre about things. And there are similarities between me and Lola as well. A couple of things like, the fact that she wants to write, how she gets swept up in stories as well, and how she is quite coldly logical about things at times. I think that's definitely something I've been accused of. So, yeah.
Just a reminder to everyone who is watching, you can put your questions in the chat, please do, even if they aren't spoiler questions, because we're going to go into the spoiler section in a minute. We can still ask them during the spoiler section, so don't worry about that. Put all of them in your in the chat, and also, even if you are someone who hasn't quite finished the book and is going to pause it, if you ask a question now, when you come back to watch it, Kat will have answered it. So last question before we go into spoilers, just a nice question that I know that you've already seen, that Jen asked on Twitter. What is your perfect evening? Comfy pajamas, night out on the town, old movie, trashy reality shows? And then in brackets, Jen's just put, no judgment.
Thank you for that. I think my ideal night would be comfortable pajamas, glass of wine, watching a real trashy movie, something along the lines of, especially a shark movie. So something like The Meg, Deep Blue Sea, something along those lines, just perfect for me.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, Deep Blue Sea, what a classic.
Absolutely.
I saw on Netflix the other day, they've added, I think it's Netflix, the new crocodile movie or alligator movie about a girl who gets trapped in a house during a hurricane or something, and there's like a gator has found its way into the house. Like, on the list, like that's my trashed. Oh dear. Right, so we are now in spoiler territory. Please pause now if you haven't finished the book and come back later. One, they're all paused. So, right, first of all, what's the reception from the book been like? Have you found that there's been a lot of horror fans who have gravitated towards it, or like YA fans who are like, oh, I decided to try this horror book for the first time? Has it been kind of a good experience for you, kind of seeing the different people's reactions, especially to the twists and turns and ending kind of element of it?
Yeah, I mean, I do try and avoid any I avoid Goodreads, but all the responses that I've had sent to me have been, quite varied and interesting. I've been enjoying people saying, how they couldn't read it when it was dark, and how it gave them nightmares. Yay! So, always gratifying to hear. But yeah, it seems to be really positive, and I'm glad so many people seem to be enjoying it. So that's great.
There's been a lot of people on Discord who have done the whole, so I was like, it was like 11 at night and I was like, I might just start the start of the book for this week, and now it's like 2 a.m. and I'm finished. Like, it was a very kind of sucked you in kind of book, because I think you do want to know like what is going to happen next. There's always something going on, there's always something happening or some mystery that you're not quite sure what's going on. And especially these elements, when you do have a first person narrator, there is this element of the unreliable narrator. Any book, and I think with this one it became like it's even more apparent towards the end, when you realize that so much of the stuff she hasn't been thinking about deliberately, that you're not sure whether her bag going missing should be creepy or not, or whether you just think it's creepy because it's a horror book, or whether it's completely normal for like it to have accidentally been left in the back of a car, or maybe it's actually to do with her grandma having memory problems and she put it somewhere without realizing it. It's nothing sinister at all. What was that process like for you in terms of coming up with the red herrings, or coming up with these elements of, not out and out horror, but like tension building stuff?
Yeah, well, lots of the things like the ones that you mentioned there, I mean, with it being kind of a more psychological horror. You have to have at least 2 possible explanations for everything that's going on. So there has to be the absolute, reality-based version, like, girls are going missing because they're either running away from town or they're falling into sinkholes. So, there is that real possibility there. But then you have the other, more paranormal explanation for things going on. It's all Mr. Jitters, obviously, so you have to have 2 explanations for every little mystery. And sometimes, people will lean more strongly one way or the other in their interpretation of what's happening. So that's always been interesting to see as well. You see people who are adamant at the end when they've read the book, they're like, well, obviously everything was in her head and, Mr. Jitters wasn't real. And it's like, how sure are you? And other people who are like, oh my God, he was obviously real, but there's also so much going on in Lola's life as well that it just kind of like tied in together. But how much was real, how much wasn't? So that's very much down to readers' interpretation, and I'm not going to say how much was real and how much wasn't.
I mean, we have some questions from people who are like questioning that. So what I'll do, if I read one of them, if it's one of those things where you're like, I don't want to say either way, be a mystery, Kat, that's totally fine. But I think it might also be interesting, like people on the stream and also you just hearing about what different people's interpretations, because you're right, there's people who have interpreted it very strongly in different directions. So like Hand Squirrel, for example, if Mr. Jitters was a figure of a traumatic event, were the other little birds' disappearances what the authorities thought? Who knows?
Well, again, that is one of those things. It depends on how you interpret it. You could read Mr. Jitters as just being an urban legend, and that, Lola kind of obsesses on it when she moves to town. And that, the other little birds ran away or, met with a sticky end some other way, because, all small towns have their weirdos and you never know what might have happened in the woods at night. But yeah, it could have been the other way as well, that Mr. Jitters is real and that his evil essentially has kind of infiltrated the people of Harrow Lake and Lola herself when she goes there. So yeah, I'm not going to clarify that one.
I'm going to do it as a statement rather than as a question from Levi, because it's in a similar vein. Levi says, I've got this whole theory in my head that Larry was acting as Mr. Jitters to take care of Lola, just like he did with her mum after Nolan told him what actually happened. I'm quite curious to see if that's anywhere near the truth, but it sounds like it's an open to interpretation, which I like. I like horror stuff which is, and psychological stuff which allows multiple readings or kind of questions at the end. Was Lola always going to have been the one who stabbed her father? Was that always the plan from the very beginning, like part of the conception of the idea? Or was it ever like, oh, there was someone else who attacked him and it was just kind of the inciting incident to bring her to Harrow Lake?
It was always part of the story that she had done it. I did go back and forth on it a little bit, but that was always the idea behind Lola's character and how she behaves. It all stemmed from that. And the way that she was raised by Nolan, very claustrophobic and controlling way, that was always tied back to the fact that she had to have had this trauma that would lead her to stab Nolan. And so that was always part of the plan. I did go back and forth on it, but that ended up staying.
Similarly, question from 20-something. Was there ever, well, that question is, was Mr. Jitters real at any point during writing the story? Was the monster always going to be someone else? So I guess, like, not necessarily coming down on an answer, but I guess, was there ever a point in which you had a very strong idea about the truth? Or in your head, is it still ambiguous and you're kind of going to leave it that way?
Yeah, it's going to remain ambiguous. Everything all the evidence that I wanted to put into the story is there in the book. And I think that I've only put in as much as will leave it open to interpretation. So I don't think it wouldn't be right if I was to say, no, actually, it comes down on this side of the fence. I think, if I intended for that to be the the way it played out, then I should have written that as the ending. But no, it was always my intention for it to be open to interpretation.
I guess question about knowledge, not of the audience, but of the characters. How do you negotiate the relationship between what characters know and what the audience knows, and like what you reveal at what time to the characters and to the audience? Is that something for you that has to be like very carefully plotted? Is it something that you insert sort of afterwards as part of redrafts?
It's kind of a trial and error thing, and it takes a few fresh readers to be able to sort of gauge whether or not you've put certain clues in, certain scenes, certain reactions in at the right place. You know, you generally know, because I have a few critique partners that I'll send my drafts out to, and they'll give me very honest feedback, for which I'm very grateful. And they'll ask questions at certain moments in the draft that will let me think, oh, actually, I need to build in more clues before that, or maybe move a certain reveal later on, you know, things like that. It's just all part of the ironing out process when I'm doing my revisions.
I kind of like started talking about it before, but then was like, I'm gonna wait for a little bit, which was backstories of the other characters. I think one of the other things about having like the small town vibe is exactly what I'm pretty sure like Cora will, this kind of thing that Cora would have said, like that is part of what small town life is, that like everyone sort of knows each other and everyone's trapped there in a lot of ways, kind of feeling like you can't escape, and that everyone's backstories are linked in a way that doesn't feel forced, right? It doesn't feel like, oh wow, what a coincidence, you knew her mom. It's like, oh yeah, you will have all been in the same class of the one high school that was in this area, so that makes total sense. So it was like it was really interesting, those kind of how those things tied in. I wonder if you talk about those decisions about, you know, having these connections between characters. Was that to do with fleshing out the characters? Was that to do with wanting to create more red herrings? Was it just a kind of a side effect of having that small town, that it felt like it was more realistic to have these connections happen between everyone?
It was kind of, well, I think it mirrored the claustrophobic setting that I wanted to create, because it's quite a small cast of characters who play, you know, any kind of part in the story. I think there are maybe 10 characters who might have any actual impact in the story. So it's quite a small cast of characters, and essentially they're made up of two families. So yeah, it was quite a claustrophobic little group of people to kind of mirror that claustrophobia that, you know, Lola has experienced throughout her life, and the town itself of Harrow Lake. You know, it's such a small town and such a warped history. I thought, yeah, that would show itself in the characters.
Can we talk about the frame narrative? And by that I mean, can we talk about Cora? No, can we talk about I mean, like I just found that so exciting, because I mean, I kind of hesitated to talk about it, even though it doesn't necessarily feel like a spoiler, because it's literally the first, that interview section right at the beginning, almost prologue, where we find out that his daughter is missing, and now we're flashing back a year. So we kind of know that there's something going on. And even though I did read this book in like a couple of days, like it was a really short sitting, I had genuinely forgotten until about 3/4 of the way through that she was missing. And then suddenly I was like, oh no, oh God, all of this is potentially Emma being dead. I'd kind of forgotten about that because I was getting so invested in Lola. And then I was like, oh God, the beginning. And having like the initials, which is obviously a big kind of a normal thing to do in interviews and written interviews. And then kind of realizing this little dropped hint of Cora wanting to be a writer, wanting to kind of go out and do investigative journalism kind of thing, made sense. That I kind of realized about 2 seconds before it got revealed, which is always, I think, one of the most satisfying twists or kind of information reveals, is when you as an audience realize 2 seconds before. So you're like in the middle of your wait, and then it actually like you see the next bit, or you see the next thing on screen, and you're like, yes, that was what I thought. Like, how did that? I'm so interested in like that process of, was it that you knew that there was going to be a connection between, that there was going to be some kind of framing with Nolan, so you kind of got a sense of him from I guess an objective point of view, because for the rest of the book we're seeing him through Lola's eyes, and she obviously has a very particular idea about him, and he controls a lot of even her thoughts about herself, her thoughts about what's happening. She hears his voice in her head. Whereas when we've got these two interviews, we have this outside view of like what this person, although we know he's talking to a journalist, so it might not be exactly what he thinks, there is this like belligerence and this rudeness and like all of this kind of stuff that maybe Lola wouldn't be able to bring herself to think about him right now, especially when he's hospitalized. Was that kind of a specific choice that was always going to be part of it, that frame narrative of wanting to hear about what happens from that different point of view? Was it something that you always knew this character Cora was going to be across it and kind of link it together? How did that kind of structure come about?
Well, I knew that I wanted it to end with Nolan essentially getting his comeuppance as the bad guy, who so often don't in real life, but I wanted him to pay for what he'd done, basically. And if that was to come about through Lola, coming back at the end and, having a showdown with him, that would lead it more into a revenge arc for her, which it wasn't, because Lola's story isn't one of revenge, because that would mean it focused too much on Nolan then. I wanted her to have her own arc and for her own independence and her own life to be more important at the end than having revenge on her father. So that left it open then to, well, how does he get his comeuppance and how can that be meaningful to the rest of the story? So that was where that framework kind of came to play in, and where Cora really developed much more as a character in my mind, because she was a quirky young girl who Lola meets in Harrow Lake, and is quite useful because she tells her a lot of the story that goes hand in hand with Harrow Lake itself, the town. But this gave her an extra dimension, and it lets you see Cora, like how she develops years after the events that play out throughout the main narrative of the story. So yeah, I liked getting to use her in that framework.
I just think we have another question from Isabel. Was the idea of her being missing something that came immediately, or did you originally plan any type of reunion, I guess either with Nolan or with Cora or with some of the other characters, to kind of show that she was okay?
Yeah, there is only that very small the book review at the end that kind of lets you know that Lola is alive and she read the book, and it went very well for her in the end. So there is only that one snippet that kind of makes it clear. I did consider bringing Lola's story back again, having an epilogue that would just focus on Lola, but I think the story that needed to be told in Harrow Lake was what was told there, and then you hopefully as a reader you get the closure that you need from knowing that actually she's okay. She isn't dead. She might have gone missing and she never went and had any epic showdown with Nolan, but she's all right. So hopefully that was something readers enjoyed.
Well, because I as we've already covered, made a mistake of reading some of this in the dark and was like, I'm just gonna wait till morning real quick, like don't need that, especially because I was reading it as an ebook, so I didn't even have to like have a light on to be reading a physical book. So I was in the darkness with a tiny phone light, like everyone can see me but I can't see anything in this room. I like genuinely had a moment of like, oh my god, like emotion, just like triumphant and kind of like a little bit teary with like the last bit with Cora, and specifically the last line where she talks to Lola in the interview, where it says, and Lola, if you're out there, I hope you're writing that damn book, girl. Because I'm just like, oh god, just there's something about like, yeah, this character who Lola's own kind of trauma and everything she was going through meant that she couldn't necessarily see anyone's intentions as good. And then when you look at it objectively, it's like, it's basically this girl who doesn't treat her like she's just like interesting because of her father, who invites her to go out with them, who kind of has a little bit of like a, okay, you are my brother, all right, I see you. Kind of this is Adam Zipporah that actually, if you look at it objectively, you're like, oh, she's kind of chill. And then she comes afterwards and like partly driven by clearly like her investment in this girl and driven by her own kind of interest in getting out of the town and kind of being inspired by that, has this real moment of like, you get it, girl, like yes, you like brilliant. And having the book review afterwards, I had a little moment of like, oh my god, yes, I just want them all to thrive, like I want them all to love that damn town and just have a good time afterwards. But like, I guess thinking about that, did you do a lot of research into because Lola's having a very specific experience of like repressed memories and trauma and hallucinations potentially. Like there's a lot of stuff going on there that like, whether or you, like you were saying, there has to be more than one explanation, right? So you have to be able to feasibly believe, one, that this could be a supernatural occurrence or something to do with the stories in this town, but it also has to be believable as like a psychological condition or like something that was going on in the mind. Was that something that you looked into? Were you kind of inspired, not necessarily by kind of medical phenomenon, but by other horror movies that had done similar kind of unreliable narrator, psychological torture kind of stuff?
Oh yeah, I wanted to make it as perhaps authentic's the wrong word, but as plausible as I could do. You know, Lola doesn't have access to mental health help, so you know she wouldn't have a diagnosis as such. But you know, in my layman sort of research way, I did look into, you know, what kind of diagnoses would include like hallucinations and things like that. And based on the kind of upbringing that she had and the violence that she witnessed, I was reading more into things like PTSD with psychosis, and which would have, you know, symptoms that could plausibly just, you know, sit alongside what actually I had plotted. So yeah, I tried to make it work in that respect. I didn't want it to be just complete, you know, pie in the sky. I, you know, used whatever symptoms I wanted. So I tried to make them fit into what, you know, I'm not medically trained or anything like that. So just make it fit into what seemed like it would plausibly work, and hopefully it does.
Just a little reminder to anyone who is watching, we are very nearly at the end of the stream. We've pretty much got like a question or so left. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask Kat, now is the time to put them in the chat, just in case. So just in case this is the last question, it makes sense to ask you about the future. Are you writing anything right now? What's on your plate in terms of new books or new stories?
Yeah, I'm currently working on my next book, which will hopefully be out next summer. I am sort of in the early drafting phases of it. So it has a lot of murder in it, you know, yay. It's quite dark. I'm not sure whether it's going to sit firmly in like thriller, murder mystery, or veer into horror, more like Harrow Lake did. But I think it's going to be something that, you know, readers who enjoyed Harrow Lake will hopefully enjoy this one too. I think it goes quite dark, quite sinister, and quite weird. So
love that. I think that is a great place to end, kind of leaving us kind of excited about your next work. I know that everyone who we've had respond to the book club has really, really loved the book, couldn't put it down kind of thing. Oh, we've had a message from Lucian, not a question, but a great thing to end on as well. Lucian said, I was so enthusiastic about the book that my brother is going to pick it up too, so yay.
Oh, yay. Thank you, Lucian.
But my brother also would not allow me to tell him any of the questions I was going to ask you in the spoiler section, because he also decided to read the book after I kind of did what is a really, honestly, such an exciting kind of one sentence pitch of being like, you know, famous horror director's daughter ends up going to the town where his most famous film was set and where her mother used to live after he's attacked in their New York apartment. What about that does not scream a book that you can read? Isabel says it's the first horror book I've ever read. Totally loved it. So
good.
I like it when we can end on some nice little comments from people in the chat who've loved the book. So yeah, again, everyone who has been taking part in these streams, who are watching afterwards, thank you so much. It's been a fantastic 4 weeks. And we are, again, going to be trying to continue it on. So please just keep a lookout on the platform channels. You can see in the description of this video, there's a place where you can sign up to our newsletter where we will be telling you all about it. We'll be shouting about it on Twitter and Instagram. I'll probably make another video on the YouTube channel. So if you are subscribed to us anywhere or follow us anywhere, you will find out about it. And if you have any of our, you know, Penguin YA authors that you think we should include, that you'd love to have on one of these live streams in the coming months, let us know as well, because we are going to be, I think, next week having a little chat about what authors we might bring in for the rest of the year. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much, Kat, for an amazing live stream. It was wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for all the questions that came in from readers as well.
You've all been brilliant. Okay, and bye.